Chapter 3, Discovering the New Victoria. Do not you think she looks younger and more beautiful than when you first met her? And that at that time she was only 18 years old, and she was very beautiful. Connor said analytically, as he stood next to Lord Melbourne, both looking out the window of the library at Victoria, Lazen, and Lizzie chatting animatedly in the garden. I do not get it. You told me that Victoria was the Queen. Lord Melbourne said, confused and still nervous. I told you that the Queen was called Victoria, I did not tell you that she was your Victoria, Connor replied quietly. In this reality, Queen Victoria has another physical aspect, that's how her looks, he added, pulling out from his jacket an image of daguerreotype, which seemed recent, and in which came out posing with a regal pose a girl a little plump. This young lady is Queen Victoria? Asked Lord Melbourne in disbelief, without being able to finish believing it. In this moment, in this place, in this one here and now. Yes, she is Queen Victoria, Connor said, walking a few steps to the table and pouring himself a glass of brandy, but your Victoria is the one is out there. But is she really Victoria? Lord Melbourne asked anxiously, watching Victoria through the window, while she smiled charming and sweetly at little Lizzie. William, does not it bother you that I call you William? Connor asked politely, and seeing that Lord Melbourne made a gesture that he did not bother, he continued, you have to stop looking for a rational explanation to things, because they do not have them. What you have to understand is which that wonderful, and beautiful girl that is out there is the Victory that you knew, and that you fell in love with. It is in flesh and spirit, her soul is the same, and from that can be guaranteed a messenger of the heavens like me. Lord Melbourne saw Victoria through the window as he listened to Connor, without he could finish to calm down himself. However, there are differences, Connor continued, looking at Lord Melbourne intensely, drawing his attention. You imagine that Victoria had not been granddaughter, and niece of kings. You imagine that Victoria had not been the only daughter of Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, fourth son of King George III, and therefore she had not become the heir to the crown, by a series of fortunate coincidences and some tragedy. Connor walked and stood next to Lord Melbourne, brandy glass in hand, and stared Victoria at the window, while Lord Melbourne looked at him with deep interest. Now imagine that instead Victoria would have been the daughter of very poor parents, that instead of belonging to the royal family she would have been born into a very humble family, from a poor and marginal neighbourhood of London. You imagine how different then she would have been. If Victoria had grown up in a school for poor or orphaned girls, instead of growing within the rigid and strict Kensington system, if she would have grown into yet another more oppressive and cruel system, that of the Lowood institution. Connor turned away from Lord Melbourne and turned to look at him, opening his arms to emphasize what he was saying. If you, instead of being the son of a viscount, a rich and influential nobleman, if you had been the son of a shopkeeper, a servant, a schoolmaster, or even a factory worker, how would that have influenced your personality? How different would you be of the person you see in the mirror every day? I guess you've never thought about it. Lord Melbourne turned to see Victoria, the moment her, Lazen and Lizzie left of the garden to enter the house. Now let me ask you another question, William, said Connor, leaving the empty glass on the table and approaching Lord Melbourne to see him face to face. If Victoria had not been the Queen, would you have married her? Lord Melbourne saw him between sad and disconcerted. Yes, of course, if she had wanted to, I would have married her. If she had been any other person in the world except the Queen of England, I would have proposed marriage. Lord Melbourne responded. And now that the crown of Great Britain no longer stands between both, now that you are no longer inferior to her, now that Victoria is your servant and lives under your roof, now that she is inferior to you, what will happen? Connor said, in a tone of amiable challenge, what will you do, William? Do you mean? Lord Melbourne said without finishing the question, nervous. I think it's pretty obvious what I mean, or are you going to continue denying yourself happiness? Are you going to despise a second chance? What will be your excuse now? Tell me, William, what do you want to do? Connor said as if it were a slight reproach. Lord Melbourne was silent for a moment, an intense emotion reflected in his face. I do not know where to start. Lord Melbourne finally confessed, his voice cracked and his eyes wet, even unable to keep a tear from escaping. Because you do not start by opening your heart. Connor replied with an affectionate tone and a friendly smile as he placed a hand on Lord Melbourne's shoulder. Open your heart as you have not done for many years, perhaps since your marriage failed and you lost your wife and then your son. Open your heart as maybe you should have done it with Victoria many years ago, in your reality, when she opened yours for you. Forget about duty, honor, responsibility, loyalty, patriotism, are burdens that no longer weigh upon your shoulders, ballasts that have been left behind on the road. You should only think on your feelings and those of the people you love, especially those of Victoria. Do it, my friend, and you will see that everything will turn out well. Let love guide you and you will have what you deserve. Lord Melbourne was impressed, then smiled. A wide and happy smile, the happiest smile he had ever drawn on his lips for many years. His green eyes shone with childish joy as well, and his whole face brightened with enthusiasm. Where were you years ago, Connor? Because I would have appointed you minister in my cabinet. Lord Melbourne said with a small laugh. I would have accepted it delighted. Cabinet ministers are very successful with women, Connor replied mockingly and with a laugh. Meanwhile Lazan and Victoria, after leaving Lizzie in a room, she drawing, they went to the servants' dormitories, and on the way they crossed with Miss Scarratt. Miss Scarratt, this is Miss Victoria Edwards, the new governess of Miss Lizzie, Lazan said. It's a pleasure, Miss Scarratt, said Victoria, with a gentle smile. The pleasure is mine, Miss Edwards. I am Miss Lizzie's personal maid, replied Miss Scarratt, very kindly. Miss Scarratt is in charge of Miss Lizzie's dress, grooming, and hair, and in the absence of a governess in recent weeks she has taken over some of her duties, Miss Edwards. Now you two will work closely, under my supervision of course, Lazan said, going to Victoria. Miss Scarratt, please escort Miss Edwards to her bedroom, the one next to hers, he said to Scarratt. Yes, Mrs. Lazan, said Miss Scarratt. Victoria and Scarratt walked away talking animatedly until they reached Victoria's bedroom. Do you like your bedroom, Miss Edwards? Scarratt asked. Yeah, a lot. It's pretty big. And please, just call me Victoria, at least when we are alone, Victoria said affectionately. Okay, and you can call me Eliza. And if this room looks great for you, expect to see Miss Lizzie's room, and let's not say Lord Melbourne's, which looks immense despite having a double bed that's 2 or 3 times bigger than one of our beds, Miss Scarratt replied with a mocking smile, although he does not use it much. Why? Victoria asked curiously. He's usually sleeping in the library, in his favorite armchair, Scarratt replied. Seriously? Victoria exclaimed in surprise. It's just a habit, said Miss Scarratt, thinking she might have said too much, but he's a good employer, he's very kind and understanding, he treats his employees fairly well, although Mrs. Lazan is the one who deal most with us, and she is strict. I thought he is a charming man, Victoria could not help saying, blushing and with a cute and sweet gesture on her face, remembering Lord Melbourne's intense stare after he kissed her hand. Charming. And maybe handsome? Scarratt asked with a mischievous smile at the sight of Victoria's face. I do not know. I do not look at that, Victoria replied ashamed, as if they'd caught her doing something wrong. Surely, replied Miss Scarratt, with a certain irony and malicious gesture on her face, well, I'll help you get settled. That night Victoria had fallen asleep, happy and excited about her new job, and also because the image of Lord Melbourne's gaze often slipped into her memories of the day. But worse was Lord Melbourne, who could not sleep all night, sitting in his library, anxious to know that Victoria was staying somewhere else in the mansion, quite close to him in comparison to the remoteness that had tormented him for years. The next day Lord Melbourne was spying on Victoria while teaching Lizzie. He peered through a half-open doorway to the living room where Victoria was teaching the little girl. Victoria had infinite patience, and she showed the girl love and sweetness, but with skill and subtle firmness she also forced her to study. The little girl was charming, but a bit vague for studies. "I propose something to you, Lizzie," Victoria said affectionately. "We study an hour without interruptions, then we make a 15-minute recess to play, and then we study another hour, and we do another 15-minute recess. Do you agree? An hour is a long time." Lizzie protested, with a comical and sweet tantrum. "All right. How about 45 minutes of classes and a break to play 20 minutes? Victoria offered with a kind smile, as if she were talking to an adult. "I like that more!" cried Lizzie with a chuckle. "I also propose something else," Victoria said, sitting on a chair, taking Lizzie and sitting her on her lap. "You will advance in the studies. For every good qualification I will give you a prize, as a new game that I'm going to teach you, a new story that we are going to read together, or a craftsmanship that we will do together as well." "That good? You're very pretty and sweet, Victoria," Lizzie said, stroking Victoria's cheek. "Seriously? Or do you say it for the rewards?" Victoria replied amused, while stroking the hair to Lizzie. "Is not true. My Uncle William thinks so too," Lizzie said innocently. Lord Melbourne swallowed thickly and felt ashamed. "Your uncle thinks I'm pretty?" Victoria exclaimed, surprised and blushing. "Yes, before coming with you, he told me that my new governess was a very beautiful and sweet girl, and that I behaved well with you," Lizzie replied indifferently. "Wow, what things!" Victoria exclaimed, with a shy smile, a gesture of shame on her face and red cheeks. Lord Melbourne also smiled in dismay and walked away from the door. At lunchtime Lord Melbourne ate with certain regrets, for he knew that Victoria was eating with the servants of the mansion in the dining room of the kitchen. He could not stop seeing Victoria as the queen he met, and it seemed almost sacrilege that she eat with the servants while he ate in the main dining room with his niece. Later in the afternoon, he went out for a walk in the garden, trying to clear his mind and think of the way he would use to approach Victoria and woo her. Deep down, he would have wanted to come up and propose marriage to her without preamble, but he knew he could not do it. In that strange reality Victoria had just met to him, and she would have thought he was a dangerous madman if he proposed marriage to her under such circumstances. Lost in his thoughts, Lord Melbourne found Victoria sitting on a bench in the garden reading a book. "Lord Melbourne, good afternoon," Victoria said, standing up and closing the book with a shy smile. "Good afternoon, Miss Victoria," said Lord Melbourne, trying to contain his emotion. "Mrs. Lazen said I could go out into the garden during my free time," Victoria said shyly. "Of course, no problem. May I ask what you are reading?" Lord Melbourne said kindly. "It's a biography of Queen Elizabeth," Victoria said softly. "Queen Elizabeth had a very interesting relationship with the Earl of Leicester," said Lord Melbourne, remembering with some sadness the times that he and Queen Victoria spoke of Leicester and Elizabeth as an example for their relationship, especially at that costume ball, after he rejecting to her declaration of love in Brocket Hall. "Oh yeah. It was a very special relationship," Victoria blushed. "Miss Victoria, I do not want to disturb you or interrupt your interesting reading, and of course you are in your spare time and I have no right to dispose of it, but I was wondering if you would like to walk with me, to show you the garden. I would like to be your guide in the gardens of Brocket Hall, so that you may know them well," said Lord Melbourne with shyness and covered anxiety, with puppy eyes. "Oh, of course, my lord. For me, it is an honour and a pleasure," Victoria answered in amazement and nervousness, and with a certain contentment. "Magnificent!" Lord Melbourne exclaimed, and gestured for her to walk beside him, not daring to offer her his arm so that she would not consider him very strange or daring. They walked side by side, and Lord Melbourne was showing her the gardens, and telling her the details about the architectural elements and the different varieties of trees. Victoria listened with interest and often smiled at Lord Melbourne's remarks. They finally arrived at the exact place where in another time, or another reality, Lord Melbourne rejected Victoria's emotional declaration of love. As at that moment, a flock of rooks flew in front of them, and Lord Melbourne could not help feel sad to remember. Victoria noticed his change of mood, and tried to fill the awkward silence that was made. "There are a lot of rooks in Brocket Hall, my lord," Victoria commented softly and with genuine interest. "Yes, it's one of the things I like about Brocket Hall. From seeing them since little boy here, I have affection to them, and they ended up becoming a study object for me. I am like those people who have a hobby, like those who collect stamps or butterflies, but mine is to observe the rooks and study all the information about them. It relaxes me, especially when I have worries," said Lord Melbourne, finishing with one of his particular smiles. "I find them interesting, too, like most animals," Victoria replied with sincerity and enthusiasm. "In Lowood I studied some zoology, and what I read in the available books about rooks seemed interesting to me. Of course you know much more about the subject. Something that caught my attention was knowing that rooks are monogamous animals and that they mate for life." Lord Melbourne paled, a cold sweat moistened his skin and he felt a tremor in his hands. He remembered the damn words he uttered when he rejected Victoria's declaration of love, his stupid metaphor about the rooks and his monogamy, that he used for explain to Victoria that he could never be her life partner, that he could not accept the heart that she offered him. He remembered all the pain he experienced that day, and even worse, he remembered all the unbearable suffering of later years, the lived images of the different seasons of his long and infernal Calvary. Like a slashing in his heart, he revived the agony to which he condemned himself, and felt an oppression in the chest, and as his legs failed him, and had to support a hand in the sculpture that resembled a huge vase in the that he was reclining down, that time Victoria came to declare her love to him. "Lord Melbourne. Did I said something wrong? Does it feel good, my lord? I'm going for help," Victoria said in a frightened voice, but when she made her way to seek help, the strong hand of Lord Melbourne caught her by one of her delicate arms. "Do not go this time, I beg you," Lord Melbourne exclaimed, almost pleading, causing her to look to him, with her eyes wide open in surprise, and trembling for touch of his hand on her skin. "Excuse me, Miss Victoria," said then Lord Melbourne, releasing her. "I am fine, it's just. Please, could you do something for me?" "Yes, of course. If it is in my hands, of course, my lord," Victoria replied, still nervous and astonished. "Sit down for a moment, here. I think I need to talk to someone, and I'd like you to be so kind to listen to me," said Lord Melbourne with kindness. Victoria listened in bewilderment, but nodded, and sat on the edge of the sculpture, where Lord Melbourne pointed out. He sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance between their bodies, and turned to see her with a sad smile, and then he looked straight ahead. "You see, Miss Victoria, when you mentioned that subject, the monogamy of the rooks, because it brought to my mind a memory. A memory of something I said to someone in this same place, with words very similar to the ones you used. The problem is that this memory is very painful for me, because of the context in which I said those words. That day I had to give up what I loved most in the world, I had to break the heart of two people, and one of they were me." Victoria listened in surprise, a little embarrassed, feeling like a nosy into another person's privacy, and discovering his most intimate secrets. But at the same time, she felt compassion for the pain she saw in Lord Melbourne's face. "The worst is that this other person, whose heart was also broken, never knew how painful it was for me to make that sacrifice," Lord Melbourne continued sadly and somewhat tiredly. "How to explain to someone as young as you how complex and frustrating that's life? When we are very young we believe that love can overcome any challenge however great it may be, we believe that we are immortal and invincible, and we are so idealistic that we believe that romanticism and good intention can conquer the summit of any mountain, no matter what high this may be. Then with age and with the blows of life, we become cynical and pessimistic, although we prefer to say that we are realistic. Then we understand that life is not made by young people, because of their value and idealism, but by the old resentful and bitter, and it is a trap that crushes the hearts of young people to fill them with darkness and sadness, to make them a reflection of his elders, added Lord Melbourne, closing his eyes and squeezing his closed eyelids with his fingers in a gesture of weariness. Victoria listened more and more touched, with the tremor in her face and containing the desire to mourn. She did not understand why, but she felt as if that story had something to do with her, as if she was also the protagonist of that story. The fact is, I had to do that for a sense of duty, and to protect the future of that person, and of many more people who were indirectly involved, Lord Melbourne continued, opening his eyes and turning to see Victoria intensely, causing her to shudder. Then she saw the front again and smiled wryly. It's ironic, to break a person's heart to save their destiny, to protect it from the wickedness of the world. And it's a greater irony to make someone believe that you do not love her enough, precisely because she's the person you love most in the world. As you see, Miss Victoria, life is very complex and cruel. The point is, this place used to be my favorite place in Brocket Hall, but since that day it's been a very sad place for me, and you unwittingly recalled that painful memory. I apologize, maybe you'll think I'm a fool to complain about my life, when I've been privileged surrounded by luxuries, while there are so many people living in poverty. No, my lord. I do not think so, Victoria replied in a broken voice and with a few tears running down her cheeks. Lord Melbourne offered her a handkerchief in a gallant way. Thank you, my lord. She said, taking the handkerchief and wiping the tears. I may be very young, but I understand that life is very complex, and that wealth does not necessarily give happiness, although poverty makes everything more difficult. My life has also been very hard, Lord Melbourne, despite my young age, and perhaps that has made me a little more mature than the girls my age. Please, I would like you to tell me something about your life, Miss Victoria, said Lord Melbourne with genuine interest as he looked at her tenderly. Well, I'm afraid it's not very interesting, my lord, Victoria replied with a wry smile. I was born in a poor neighbourhood in London, my father was a factory worker, and my mother was a washerwoman. When I was 2 years old my father died. I have been told that he fell ill suddenly and died in a very short time. My mother became a widow, with a small girl with no money. But shortly after she met my stepfather. Victoria twisted her face in a gesture of repulsion that did not go unnoticed by Lord Melbourne. He never loved me. I imagine that for a man it is difficult to love a creature that is not his. The fact is that my mother and her husband began to have other children. In my house there was a lot of misery and I started to hinder, especially to my stepfather. When I was 7 years old they left me at Lowood. They abandoned you as an orphan, exclaimed Lord Melbourne somewhat scandalized. Not exactly, my mother kept parental authority over me, but she appointed legal guardian to the Lowood institution, with the justification that she could not take care of me and provide for my needs. At first I suffered a lot to be away from home, but soon I got used to it. In Lowood they at least fed me and I could study, although they were also very strict, but in any case they beat me much less than what my stepfather hit me, said Victoria naturally. Your stepfather and your educators in Lowood was hit you? Lord Melbourne said with a dry throat. Yes, but it's normal for the girls growing up in that environment, my lord, Victoria replied, trying to dismiss the matter, but to her surprise she saw Lord Melbourne squeezed his jaw in a gesture of anger, his right hand in a fist, so much that he could took himself out blood with his nails. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry, said Lord Melbourne compassionately. Do not worry, my lord, it's a part of the past. I have not been beaten for years. In the end I was also an educator at Lowood, and my superiors respected and praised me, although they disliked me for refusing to administer corporal punishment to the girls in my charge. But I could not do to them what they had done to me, Victoria replied. Of course, I could not expect less from you, Lord Melbourne said with a brilliant look of admiration that made Victoria blush again and bow her head in embarrassment. "Excuse me, I know I'm abusing your indulgence, but, would you like to accompany me to another place in the garden? It's just that I want to show you something to compensate for the uncomfortable moment I made it happen to you." "Oh, of course, my lord," Victoria said between uneasy and intrigued. Lord Melbourne took Victoria to the greenhouse and entered with her into the place full of beautiful flowers, especially orchids. "They are very beautiful," Victoria exclaimed with a radiant smile and childlike joy. "It's my other hobby. Apart from the rooks and the liquor, of course," replied Lord Melbourne with irony and cheerful pride. "Do you cultivate them, my lord?" Victoria asked in ecstasy with the flowers. "Yes, it gives me a lot of peace, it's a very relaxing and rewarding job," Lord Melbourne said. While Lord Melbourne was giving her a quick lesson on the flowers he cultivated, Victoria listened with interest. He was cutting some white orchids and with it he made a bouquet. "Take it, Miss Victoria, they're for you," Lord Melbourne said cheerfully, reaching out to give her the corsage. "For me?" "Thank you, Lord Melbourne," Victoria replied shyly, her face lit, taking the bouquet. "I had never been given flowers. Every day I'm going to give you an orchid, and every now and then a full bouquet," Lord Melbourne said. "Oh no, my lord. Do not bother, it is not necessary," replied Victoria embarrassed. "I insist. For me it's no hassle, I have a lot of free time. And so you can decorate your bedroom," he said kindly. "Thank you, my lord," Victoria replied gratefully, happily. "But I would like one thing in return," said Lord Melbourne with a certain rascality. "What, my lord?" Victoria asked a little frightened, recoiling a little, as if she feared that he was going to try to take advantage of her. "A foolishness, is that I want you to call me Lord M, at least when you and me are alone," said Lord Melbourne somewhat embarrassed. "Lord M? But my lord, I do not know if that would be correct," answered Victoria, stunned. "I know it's something unusual, strange, and even ridiculous, but it's something that brings back memories of happier times. If you do not want to, of course you are free not to do so," replied Lord Melbourne shyly and a little touched. "It's okay, Lord M," Victoria said with a sweet smile, making Lord Melbourne's face lit up with joy, "and, if you do not think it wrong, I'd like you to call me simply Victoria when we're alone." "Lord M. All right, Victoria," Lord Melbourne replied with a broad smile. "I hope I did not steal all your free time, Victoria. And above all I hope I did not bore or bothered her." "No, Lord M, not at all. I am very honoured that you shared a part of your feelings with me," she replied warmly. "It was one of the most enjoyable walks in my life, despite everything. Now I give you back your freedom, Victoria," Lord Melbourne said gallantly, leaning down and kissing the back of her hand, causing Victoria to blush from head to toe and her heart racing again. Victoria asked for permission and retired, leaving Lord Melbourne at the entrance to the greenhouse. Both smiled with almost childlike joy.